Dateline, Gaza City, October 7th, 2023. Hamas forces from the Gaza Strip launched an unprecedented attack on Israel, killing about 1,200 people and taking more than 200 hostages. Hamas is an Arabic acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, a Palestinian political and military organization governing the autonomous Gaza Strip in far southwest Israel. Israel first responded with airstrikes on Gaza and later launched a ground offensive. More than 11,000 people have been killed as of November 2023, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Palestine is a geographic region roughly equal in size to the state of New Jersey, along the southwestern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In ancient times, it was the homeland of the biblical Israelites. From the late 7th century AD until modern times, it was under Islamic control. However, since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the majority of Palestinian territory has been incorporated into this modern Jewish state. And the current crisis is only the most recent chapter in the long story of the Arab-Israeli conflict for control of the territory of Palestine, with Israel adamantly claiming and violently defending her right to exist as a nation, and the Arabs equally determined to destroy her. But something about this most recent flare-up of this old conflict is different. I can't quite put my finger on it. But ever since October 7th, I've had people asking me questions about the situation in Palestine that I've never been asked before. Questions like, what are Christians to make of the goings-on in Israel? Or, shouldn't we set aside a special time at church to pray for the peace of Jerusalem? Very recently, I received an email from a young lady, well, she's young to me anyway, but a young lady who'd been a part of my youth group in the church in Snyder, Texas in the 1980s. And in it, she asked me, and I'm paraphrasing here, what are the scriptures that talk about what's happening in Israel right now? I know that I should know them, but I'm afraid that I haven't studied it like I ought to. I've been talking to a Christian guy who doesn't believe that the Israelis are God's special people, or that God promised that land to them forever, or that we are required as Christians to support and defend them. So how do I respond to him? Well, I had to write back to my young sister and tell her that I believe that the reason she can't find the scriptures she's looking for is simply because they aren't there. And what followed was a two-part correspondence with her in which I presented as clearly and succinctly as I could what I believe the Bible teaches about God's covenant promises to ancient Israel, especially as they relate to the land, and how all that relates to the modern state of Israel, if at all. From all these questions, I've come to the conviction that as church leaders, we have not given sufficient attention to teaching our congregations to accurately handle the word of truth, as Paul says in 2 Timothy 2:15. And that's particularly true insofar as it comes to discerning many of the significant differences between the Old and New Covenants. And as a man who has spent more than 40 years in the ministry of teaching in local churches, much of the blame for this falls on me. Questions like that don't make for simple, easy to teach Sunday school lessons, and so I guess I've tended to avoid them altogether, inadvertently leaving our people to turn for answers to the glitzy television preachers who espouse doctrines with which I fundamentally disagree. And so what follows in this series is my best effort to right that wrong. The two parts of this series will consist of different but complementary types of material. They're actually an extended version of my responses to the questions I received from my young friend that I mentioned earlier. Part 1 will be a Bible study, and in it we will look at texts from both the Old and New Testaments that shed light on God's promise of a land for the ancient people of Israel. This session will span the entire period of time from God's initial promise to Abraham to Jesus' proclamations about the future of the Jewish people with regard to their possession of that land. Part 2 will be a political and historical study. We will study the occupation and control of the Israelites' ancient homeland from the 2nd century AD down to the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 and the conflicts that have followed upon that. We will conclude with some observations which I hope will help us to frame the current context within the biblical teachings from Part 1. I want to start with what I see as the biblical teaching about Israel, the Mosaic Covenant, and its promises of the land of Israel to the Israelite people. The verses I'm quoting are drawn from out of larger context, so be sure and read at least the entire chapter in which they're found to get the big picture about what was going on when these promises were given. The readings I'll be using are from the 1995 edition of the New American Standard Bible. The root of God's promise of a land for the Israelites is found in Genesis chapter 12. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. It was a simple, rather open-ended promise. Abram might have even wondered how much land God was talking about here. Did Abram understand God to mean that his descendants would receive all the land that he had traversed in Canaan up to that point? Or did he perhaps understand God to mean only as much land as he could see at the time the promise was given? Either way, Abram's vision would have been much too small for what God had in mind for his descendants. When we read ahead to chapter 15, we find a much more formal and much more detailed expression of the same promise. Whereas before, God had made what may seem like a simple, off-the-cuff promise, here he commits himself to this promise with a binding oath. And this spectacular oath is recorded in Genesis 15. So he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Then he brought all these to him, and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven, and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, and the Kenizzite, and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite." This scene is extraordinary to us, but it involves elements that were common to the binding of oaths between two parties at that time. Certain animals would be killed and cut in half, with the body parts laid opposite one another, creating a path in between. Then the parties to the covenant would walk together between those bloody carcasses, signifying that if either should violate the terms of the covenant, he would suffer the same fate as the slain and dismembered animals. Now, the interesting thing about this text is that once the slain animals were properly arranged, God alone, in the image of the smoking pot and the flaming torch, passed between them. This was not a covenant between equal parties. God alone established the principles and the conditions of the Abrahamic covenant. Also in this oath, God revealed just how vast the land of promise would be. This is the best map I've been able to find of the territory that was encompassed by the description in verses 18 and 19 of our text here. And yet, even it doesn't do justice to God's great promise. The southern boundary would be the river or brook of Egypt, which was a seasonal stream on the northeastern border of Egypt. The northern boundary would be the Euphrates River, indicated by the red line at the top of this map. The land included in God's covenant promise to Abraham was enormous, much larger than was ever actually occupied by the ancient Israelites and much larger than the modern state of Israel. A third iteration of the land promise that we want to look at is found in Genesis 17, given at the same time that God changed Abram's name to Abraham. I have made you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. What we want to notice here is that God promised to establish an everlasting covenant with Abraham's descendants and to give them all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. God would be their God and they would be his people. We'll come back to the significance of all of this later in this presentation. The land promised to Abraham is repeated to Isaac and to Jacob in other passages of the book of Genesis. And so the promise is thus limited in focus to Abraham's descendants through Isaac and then through Jacob only, thereby tacitly excluding Ishmael and the many other sons he sired by his second wife, Keturah. For the sake of time, we will not read these texts right now, as they contribute nothing new to our discussion. But during the macabre ceremony of Genesis 15, God revealed to Abraham that before coming into their inheritance of the promised land, his descendants would be oppressed as slaves in a land that was not their own. But after 400 years of slavery, God would bring severe judgment on their captors. He would deliver his people out of Egypt with great substance and lead them to the land promised to Abraham. We're now going to examine some texts from the Old Testament books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. These books record the delivery of the Israelite nation from Egyptian bondage and their long journey across the wilderness to the promised land. What we want to notice here is that while the land promises are repeated, they come with specific conditions and warnings. Our first text comes from Exodus 19. It's now been 3 months since the exodus from Egypt, and the huge Israelite throng has arrived at Mount Sinai. And from the mountain, God spoke to Moses. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandment, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Do you hear the echoes of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17? God had said to Abraham, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. And here, at the inauguration of the Mosaic Covenant, God repeats the promise that he will take the descendants of Abraham to be his own special people out of all the people of the earth. But the promise, as repeated to the Israelites, comes with a condition. If you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant. That little word if, which in Hebrew is im, that's a powerful word. Now, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but I read the books of the ones who are. And in the Enhanced Strong's Lexicon of Biblical Hebrew, the word im is defined as a conditional participle. It implies that a desired outcome can be realized only under certain stated circumstances or situations. Here, the desired outcome is that Israel will be God's own special people, with all the attendant benefits, including the possession of the land. The stated condition is that you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. Now let's move ahead about 3 books in about 40 years. We're in the book of Deuteronomy now, and the 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness is over. The faithless generation that made that long sojourn necessary is dead, and their children are poised to enter the promised land at last. In chapter 4, at the point of bringing this part of the promise to Abraham to fruition, God, through Moses, issues this dire warning. When you become the father of children and children's children, and have remained long in the land, and act corruptly, and make an idol in the form of anything, and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you're going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. The conditions could not be made any clearer. If, after taking possession of the land, the Israelites should break faith with God and violate the terms of the covenant, they would forfeit their promised land. The book of Deuteronomy is composed of a series of addresses that Moses made to the generation of Israelites who were about to enter the promised land. And near the end of the book, in chapter 28, the conditional nature of their continued possession of the land is stressed once more. If you are not careful to observe all the words of this law which are written in this book, to fear this honored and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring extraordinary plagues on you and your descendants, even severe and lasting plagues, and miserable and chronic sicknesses. He will also bring back on you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they will cling to you. Also every sickness and every plague, which not written in the book of this law, the Lord will bring on you until you are destroyed. Then you shall be left few in number, whereas you were as numerous as the stars of heaven, because you did not obey the Lord your God. It shall come about that as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you and multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you, and you will be torn from the land where you are entering to possess it. To take the land was one thing. To keep it was another. God, speaking through Moses, made it crystal clear that the covenant promise of Israel's possession of the land was good only insofar as they maintained faithfulness to that covenant. Now let's move to the book of Joshua. Probably at least 20 years have passed now since the Israelites crossed over Jordan into the promised land. In a series of amazing battles, they have conquered the central hill country of the land, but much more remains yet to be taken. Nevertheless, the land is divided up and assigned by lot to the 12 tribes of Israel. They are home at last. And now, nearing the end of his life, Joshua, Moses' successor and the leader of the wars of conquest, addresses the victorious Israelites one last time. This reading is from Joshua chapter 23. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you. And as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves, to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land, which the Lord your God has given you. There is no room for doubt that God made a magnificent promise of possession of the land once known as Canaan to the ancient nation of Israel through the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants. But there is also no room for doubt that these promises were not unconditional or irrevocable. Now we're going to move ahead to the time of Jesus. By this time, more than 1,300 years since the death of Joshua, the land has already been lost and regained once. The Babylonian exile was the consequence of the stubborn refusal of the Israelites to acknowledge the Lord as their one and only God. However, after 70 years of exile, God allowed as many of the people as so desired to return to their land and rebuild their temple and reestablish their nation. But things were not the same as they had been before. No longer were they a powerful, independent kingdom under the ruling dynasty of David. They were a vassal nation, subject to the authority of a succession of powerful world empires. Through his prophets, however, God promised that the day would come when a descendant of David, called Messiah, which means anointed one, would arise through whom all the promises of the covenant would be fulfilled. With the passing of time, the national concept of just what the nature of these promises was and how they would be fulfilled became fixed in a sort of religious orthodoxy, the messianic expectation. Well, in God's own good time, he sent his beloved and eternal Son, born as a human being, to fulfill the promises that had been made through the prophets. And so Jesus came and revealed himself to his people as their promised Messiah. He validated his claims through miraculous signs and wonders. But Jesus' ministry and teaching did not conform to the traditional messianic expectation. And except for a tiny minority, the Jews did not believe his claims, and they rejected him as their Messiah. And now, only days before he would be crucified, Jesus passes judgment on the faithless Jewish people, personified as their holy city. Matthew 23. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent against her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The Messiah had come and revealed himself to his people, but they had rejected him and would soon kill him. Therefore Jesus declared that their house, which may be properly understood as both their temple and their land, was going to be left desolate or empty. Only a few days after this, when his apostles were admiring the beauty and majesty of the temple, Jesus made a shocking prediction. The day was coming when this beautiful temple would be utterly destroyed. Matthew 24. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Not one stone left standing on top of another. According to Jesus, the temple would be utterly demolished, with the unspoken understanding that it would never be rebuilt again. And less than 40 years later, in AD 70, that was exactly what happened. The Romans invaded the province of Judea, razed the city of Jerusalem, and burned the temple to the ground. The Jewish nation, for all intents and purposes, was dead. Some 700 years later, when the former territory of Judea had fallen to Islamic conquerors, the Dome of the Rock was constructed over the ruins of the temple, making it certain that no Jewish temple could ever be built there in the future. And surprising as it may seem, none of this constituted a breach of God's promises to Abraham and the nation of Israel. True, God promised Abraham that he would give the land of his sojourning to his descendants as an everlasting possession. But the Hebrew word olam, which is translated everlasting, has more than one meaning. It essentially refers to a long period of time, and literary context must determine whether the word means eternity, or a long time into the past, or a long time into the future. Now, when we consider the conditions placed on the ongoing possession of the land in the passages we read from Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Joshua, we must conclude that in these contexts, olam carries the meaning of a long time into the future. And certainly the Israelites did possess that land for a long time into the future, nearly 1,500 years. The Greek translation of that same Old Testament word uses the word ainos to translate olam. The Greek word literally means an age. Another way to translate these passages is to say that God promised the land to the Israelite people for the age. That is, as long as the age endured. What age is that? Well, that would be the age of the Mosaic Covenant. When the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, Israel was still living under the Mosaic Covenant. And hence God, in his mercy and his covenant faithfulness, allowed them to return to their land, reestablish their nation, and rebuild their temple. But by AD 70, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed again by the Romans, the Mosaic Age had already been over for nearly 40 years, ever since the events of Pentecost in Acts 2 had inaugurated the new age of the covenant of Christ. And with the expiration of this old age, the attendant promises of Israelite or Jewish possession of the land expired also. God had fulfilled all his promises to Abraham and the Israelite nation concerning the land of Israel under the Mosaic Covenant. Now, that doesn't mean that the Jews' loss of the land was inevitable after the old covenant expired. It was not impossible, and rather it's even probable that the Israelite possession of the land would have continued even in this new age had they accepted their Messiah when he came. God, in his love and patience, gave them nearly 40 years anyway to repent and believe. But they would not. Rather, they only continued to persecute and kill the disciples as they had done to the Master. And thus Jesus' dire warning became a tragic reality. Your house is being left to you desolate. So what does all this mean for the modern state of Israel? In 1948, in the redrawing of the world map that was the aftermath of World War II, a nation called Israel appeared for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. It occupies much, but not all, of the same land occupied by the ancient Israelites. And Jewish people from all over the world, scattered by centuries of conquest and persecution, have emigrated to the modern Jewish state, which has not only survived, but thrived for 75 years now. In the creation of the modern Israel, however, hundreds of thousands of Gentile people, whose ancestors had occupied the land called Palestine for centuries, were displaced from their land and homes to make room for new Jewish settlement. And therein lies the problem. By what right or authority can a new nation be established right on top of a settled people? Obviously, the Palestinian people who have lived there for over 1,500 years say there is no such right, and the modern nation of Israel has no right to exist. Observant Jews, however, as well as a vast number of Christians, claim that the land rightfully belongs to the Jews based on God's ancient promises to Abraham's descendants. In this session, I have presented the reasons why I believe that the divine mandate granting ownership of the land of Canaan to the Israelites expired with the end of the Mosaic Covenant. However, the issues in the current Middle East conflict are more than just theological in nature. There is a historical element involving the identity and status of the Palestinian people in the larger picture of Middle Eastern history. There's also a political element entailing the legitimacy and legality of the maneuvers that led to the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And in the second part of this study, we will take a closer look at these issues.